joined today by Erin McKeown and Charity Majors. Erin comes from Zendesk. She is the Director of Engineering Resilience there. She has a lot of experience in crisis communications and leadership, disaster recovery. She spent some time at Google and Salesforce in both the risk management and business continuity worlds. Charity Majors is the co-founder and CTO of Honeycomb, the observability platform to find critical issues in your infrastructure. So today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, and I know one of their favorite topics as well, incident management. We all come from incident management from different phases of the spectrum. Charity has a lot of insight on to before the incident happens and what you're doing during the incident. Erin comes from a world where she is really actively communicating with customers and also communicating with the folks in her organization to understand what is happening in the incident and understand what is happening afterwards. And they're both leading organizations doing this as well. And I'll quickly intro myself. My name's Nora. I'm the founder and CEO of Jelly.io. We are a post-incident platform, but we kind of cover the whole stack as well, from responding to the incident to diagnosing it to understanding it afterwards. So thank you both for being here with me today.
Thanks so much for having me. This is going to be super fun.
Yes, same. Super happy to be joining the conversation.
Awesome. So I'm going to first ask Erin a question. I want to understand a little bit more about your leadership style when an incident happens at Zendesk today.
Yeah, sure. So I think what's interesting is I'll give a little context of how one of the parts of how we operate in an incident at Zendesk. I have a really amazing global incident management team and we also have different roles of those that are constantly in an incident. My incident manager, we have an eng lead on call. We also have we have our advocacy, customer facing communication role, as well as our ZNOC, which is all about the initial triage, and then all of our engineers that get pulled in.
Wait, did you say ZNOC?
Yeah, so Zendesk NOC. So
I love that. So my first ever management experience was at Linden Lab, where I founded the DNOC, the distributed NOC. So I'm just super tickled. I don't think I've ever heard of another company doing that.
Yeah. Yep. They, I actually managed them for a little bit of time, but they've moved over to a different leadership.
Awesome.
But we stay very close. We're very close with our ZNOC buddies. But yeah, I think what's interesting is during an incident, especially when I'm getting involved, because a lot of our incidents, those are managed at the incident manager level. We have our engineering leads on call that come in. If I'm there, it's a little bit of a different situation because that means that it's probably a pretty big one or something that has high visibility. And so a lot of what I'm there to do is to make sure that I'm supporting the team that's responding and keeping them, scoping those things right. But I really serve as a conduit to our leadership. It's really about how, making sure that boots on the ground are able to do exactly what they need to do. The executives that need to be informed are informed and pulled in at the right increments and the right timing. So getting that alignment is really important. And I think that, having that calm demeanor and making sure that you're managing up in these situations so that you can protect the folks that really need to be paying attention and to what they're doing right in front of them is really important during an incident.
Totally. The emotional tenor really gets set by whoever is in charge of the incident. If you're just like flapping around and just like reacting and everything, everybody in the company is going to freak out. And if you can project, calmness but intensity, right? Like you don't want people to just be like, oh, nothing's wrong. You want them to be aware that something's happening, that it's not normal, but that it's under control. I think part of the key thing is that people need to feel like they can be confident that they will be pulled in if needed, so that the entire company doesn't just have to hover and look, am I needed there? Am I needed there? Do I need to respond here? No, like in order for not everything to stop, everyone has to have confidence that they will be pulled in if they are needed or if they can help.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that I will say too is that part of having being able to come in and have that calmness also is part of having a really strong program around incident management and having good structure and how like your tooling operates, that your folks are educated on their roles and responsibilities. We also have crisis management that is the next level above that. So I think that there's at Zendesk, I feel very fortunate because everybody jumps into an incident, they're ready to go. They are happy to help out. They want to know what they can do. They're contributing in the space that they can. And I think, that's a very important piece of it makes it a lot easier to be a leader in those situations when you have folks like that are jumping in and really wanting to just collaborate and figure out what's going on.
Totally agree.
How do you, it sounds like the way you handle it is a lot more of an art than it is a science too. And it's just, really keeping a pulse on what's happening and making sure you're really present in that moment. How do you prepare folks for those situations as well, like before you're in them?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. There's a couple of different layers for that. So we actually are in the right now doing a lot of training we've got folks that have been around for a long time. We realize we have a lot of new people. So my incident management teams have been doing some regional training. They did a mayor recently. They're in the middle of doing a MIA, and we're getting amazing feedback from that. I think that both newer and older folks it's good reminders, but it's also at the same time really great education. And I think, we do other things such as shadowing. We make sure that folks that are getting onto new on calls that they're doing, they're doing a couple of sessions where they're following along and shadowing during someone else's on call so they can learn from that.
Do you do primary, secondaries?
Yeah, so it depends on the team. So we have the structure can vary a little bit depending on the size of the team, the criticality of what services they are over, things like that. So just a little bit of variance here and there. But the one last thing that I would say is we do a lot of exercising. We have our chaos engineering team that does. They have a whole suite of tests that we practice. It's really important for us to operate in that exercise as it's an incident. So we have an incident manager that participates in every single one of those exercises. We use all of our we use as much as our tooling as we possibly can to make it realistic and to get in and, do all of those things. I think those are really that's the space that I think we get the most value. And I will just say that, I think it's something that trying to expand on that a little bit wider is something that we're looking at, with Zendesk, and just because we learn so much from it. And
how time consuming is that?
I think that, so we have one primary, Zendesk is an AWS crew. And so we have, for example, we have AZ resilience testing that we do. We do an AZ resilience failover exercise. I think it's on a quarterly basis right now. So, that takes a lot of prep work because usually what we're doing with that is depending on, what incidents have we had? What areas do we need to press on? Even using AWS incidents that we've experienced.
You have AZ resiliency. Do you have region resiliency?
We have for data, we have data, but we're not
gotcha.
Yeah. We're not across multiple regions per account.
I'm curious, because it can be incredibly time consuming, and you're right, the payoff can be enormous for companies that are at the stage where it's worthwhile. But where would you say is the point at which it's worth starting to invest in that? Because it is pretty time consuming, and it really, I think it depends on the commitments you've made to your customers. What thresholds would you look for to say, okay, you should start really doing this for real as a driver?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, and I think that there's a couple of different inputs to that. First of all, starting as small as possible. Tabletop exercises are a great way to go. If you don't have a lot of time to do things, if you don't, if you're not able to prepare, your pre-prod environment to be able to actually put hands on keyboard and simulate things, you can start at a much lower level and build on top of that. I think people think right away they've got to go in and, do the big bang, right? We got to do
at what stage should they start doing that?
I think that it depends on the company, because I think that there's a different desire for whatever your business is, right?
So what what characteristics or something would you look for in a company to be like, okay, it's time for you to really start investing in these like affirmative, like active, like sort of tests?
Yeah. So I'm of the persuasion that like I think that companies right now are not starting early enough with getting incident management practices and teams and structure and testing in place.
I hate to
Usually
be
what we
annoying
know,
about this, but like I super agree. But like for specifically for like regional failovers or AZ
right?
failovers, like that's a big gun, in my
Yes.
opinion. Like where would you say that comes in?
And it's
It's
expensive
super
as well.
expensive. It's not.
Yeah.
It's not a cost. You can't just go, oh, everyone should do it as soon as they should, because that's not actually true.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it makes total sense for Zendesk to do it. You know, if you think of the nature of what they're offering and what their customers are going to say when they have incidents, like if Zendesk's tooling goes down and one of their customers is in the middle of an incident,
Yeah.
they're not able to resolve their incident. And so I feel like, you know, the urgency of doing what Erin and team are doing becomes higher in that case.
Yeah.
You know, if we're trying to think about it on like a weighted spectrum,
Yeah.
but yeah, you're right. Like some
Yeah.
organizations, it probably is not worth some of the time, I think, right now to
I'm just
Yeah. I
curious,
mean, you have
and there
to.
might be no good answer at all. I'm just because you're so
Yeah,
experienced
yeah.
in this area. I'm
And
just
I mean,
curious.
I think that like again, that's why it kind of depends, right? So like to what Nora's saying is that we're a critical like service for our customers. Like they depend on us to be able to deliver their customer support to their customers. So if we're impacted and they're unable to support their customers, that reflects on them. They don't know
Yeah.
necessarily that down the line it's a Zendesk incident that's causing that customer pain, right? So we have an obligation and the pressure to actually minimize as much as possible of that impact. Like, you know, there's the tolerance these days is a lot lower for that, right? So
Yeah.
and I think that
It used to be like, oh, AWS is down. Everybody just like go out for coffee. Like it's not like that anymore.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, I mean, I agree. I don't know if it definitely is not a one shoe fit all type of a timing, but I do think that like there are baby steps that people can take in understanding what their business needs are and what. And again, the first question that I would ask is what's the tolerance from the business for downtime or for impact? Like, I think that question is one to put back to the business and to the leaders and say like, what is our tolerance for this? Like, are you okay if we're down for this amount of time?
Do we have financial commitments? Do we have just like word of mouth commitments?
Yeah.
I think that for me, like the two things that I would say that every company should do, like pretty much across the board, if you have customers, you should do this. Number one, something is better than nothing. If it's literally like your homepage is just returning a 500 or a 502, like that's unacceptable for anyone these days. At least, you know, if your storage, if your backend writes are failing, cool. Like try to degrade gracefully enough so that you give your customers some information about what's going on and you return something, right? You should return something, and you should handle as much as possible without making false promises about what you've handled. And number two, I think to your point about tabletop exercises, I think that as soon as you're mature enough to have a platform team, an ops team, a whatever team, you're mature enough to have a meeting at least once a quarter where you look at, okay, look at your risk path, right? Your critical path. Like what are the elements in there? How can they fail? And what is like the limited thing that you can always do if some, you know, if whatever component goes down, like what's your path? What's your story? What do you try and return? You know, like at Parse, you know, we had all of these replica sets. And so like, you know, the minimum thing that we could do, like if almost everything was down except this one AZ, was we could at least like, you know, return a page that said, you know, blah, 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 or whatever. Like but you should think through what is my end user's experience going to be like and have an answer for it and try to make it as good as possible, because often that takes very little work. You just have to think about it.
And I think you both have touched on the real benefit behind this is coming up with what is a good tabletop exercise to run, right?
Yeah.
You know, it makes sense for Erin and her team to run these region exercises because that is issues they've experienced before. But what you're gearing at, Charity, is just like thinking about your user lifecycle and thinking about what matters to your users, you know, like returning something or thinking about what they're going to experience at that moment, or thinking about what the time of day is for them, or thinking about when they're most using your platform. Like those are all things to think about. It probably doesn't make sense for most orgs to just take a standard regional failover exercise. Like,
Right.
but it doesn't make sense for them to think of something. And I think a lot of the value in it is actually taking the time to work together to think of that thing. You know, what is
Totally.
the best thing for us to do right now, and really digging into what that means for everyone and why.
Facebook got 15 years into their service, and like whatever about Facebook, but like it was like 15 years. They were 15 years old as a company before they started actually investing in being able to shut down a data center. And that was driven not by them wanting to be able to do this, but by the fact that their original data center was shutting down. And so they were like, well, we got to figure this out anyway. Let's make it so that it's a repeatable process. And then kind of like what you were saying, Erin, like once a quarter from there on out, they'd do these, highly prepared, shut down a region, fail over sort of practices just for hygiene. But yeah, I think it's easy to say, oh, you should do this easier. But like when you sit down and think about it, it's costly, it's hard, it's going to take resources away. And so you should be thinking pretty narrowly about what is the least best thing. What's the 20% solution here that gives 80% of the benefit?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And like, and again, I do think it's important to know that like what I'm speaking about has been years of, I've been at Zendesk for over 7 years. We started, we had a little bits and pieces of incident management when I came on board. And so this has been, and building out our resilience organization and our reliability organization, like there's been a lot of time and effort.
What does your resilience organization look like, if you don't mind?
Yeah. So I actually have a very interesting team. I've got, so under resilience, I've got our technology continuity organization, which is all about our disaster recovery and continuity of our technology. And we have incident management, which I've mentioned already. And then I also am responsible for business continuity and crisis management at Zendesk. So not only are we focusing on the engineering pieces of things, but we also are responsible for what happens with business disruptions to the overall business operations. And then there's one other part of my team. I've got a team, our resilience tooling and data, and they are responsible for I have the engineering. The engineers are awesome, and they've built all of the in-house tooling that we have for incident management, and like they support the integrations and things like that for the other tooling that we leverage outside of Zendesk. And then we have our data team, which they're newer. We've been like obviously data is the lifeblood these days. And we have managed, they're about a year, that team's about a year old, but like, really, really doing the crunching of the data that we have related to incident manetsment and the impacts that we have as a business, and bringing those back to the business so that we can make critical decisions. So it's a interesting, wide breadth of responsibility when it comes to disruption, and the alignment there makes quite a bit of sense for the Zendesk organization.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's awesome. And like, I feel like what you're gearing at is a lot of, I think the real value of SRE, which is understanding relationships in organizations, like technology relationships, human relationships, all kinds of things. And it becomes invaluable after a while. Charity, I'm going to turn the question over to you. Can you tell me a little bit about your leadership style when an incident happens? And, and this could be your philosophy towards how folks should handle incidents in general. And it can be anything.
Yeah, these days I don't respond to incidents at all. I think I am very high up in the if it fails over the front end time engineer, and then the back end engineer, and then the successive engineer, and then something. But like I maybe get a page fail over me once a year, and it's usually an accident. Which I feel like, the people that we have are so amazing, like fucking Fred and our SRE team and Ian, and, they're amazing. And so like, I can't really take any credit for all of the amazing stuff that they're doing these days. I feel like I can take some credit for the fact that we didn't make a bunch of mistakes for the first couple of years. And so, how there's this stage that most startups go through where they're like, whoa, we're going through a lot of growth and suddenly everything's breaking. Let's bring on someone who knows something about operations, We never went through that. In fact, we didn't hire our first actual SRE for 4 years, and he was there for a year, and then he left, and then we didn't hire another for another year. We really have the philosophy of engineers write their own code, they own their code in production, and for a long time that was enough. Now these days it's not, and much like Erin, and much like you, Nora, we have a service that people rely on above and beyond their own monitoring, right? And above and beyond their own systems, because they need to be able to use it to tell what's wrong with their own systems. And which, I know we're going to talk about build versus buy a little later on. And this is where I have to put my plug in for, you should never, as an infrastructure company, put your monitoring and your observability on the same fucking hardware, the same colo as your own production systems, because then when one goes down, you've got a million problems, right? They should be very much segregated and separated, whether you're buying something or building it yourself. But TLDR, I think we did a lot of things early on that were helpful. For a long time, we only had one on-call rotation, and all the engineers were in it. One of my philosophies about on-call is that the rotation should be somewhere between about 7 people, right? Because you don't want it to be so short that everyone's getting, you want them to have like 2 months, a month to 2 months between on-call stints, right? You want to give them plenty of time to recover, but you don't want to give them so long they forget how the system works, or so long the system changes. And when your system is changing rapidly, like more than 2 months, it's just too long. So now we have multiple on-call rotations, of course, but I guess the main philosophical thing that I will point out here is that the way that I grew up dealing with outages and monitoring and everything, they were very much intertwined, right? The way that you dealt with outages was the way that you debugged your system, and vice versa, And really, when you were dealing with a LAMP stack or a monolith, you could look at the system, predict most of the ways it was going to fail, write monitoring checks for them. Like 70% of the work is done because all of the logic was tied up inside the application, right? It would fail in some weird ways, but you tease them out over the next year or so, and only like a couple times a year would you really just be like completely like puzzled, like what the hell is going on? Like, it didn't happen that often. But these days, it happens all the time. It's almost like every time you get alerted these days, it should be something genuinely new, right? We've come a long ways when it comes to resilience and reliability, and when things break, we typically fix them so they don't break anymore, right? It should be something new. And now you've got microservices and multi-tenancy, and you're using third-party services and platforms and everything. And it's just wildly more complex, which is why I think you have to have engineers own their own code in production. But I also feel like the processes and the tools and the ways we think about, debugging, you need to kind of decouple them from the process of the site's down, we have to get it back up, just the emergency sort of stuff, because you can't look at it and predict 70% of the ways it's going to fail. You can't predict almost any of the ways it's going to fail. You can write some monitoring checks, but that's not going to save you much, because the system's going to fail in a different way every time, and you just have to this is where dashboards just become kind of useless, right? If you're used to just eyeballing your dashboards and going, it's that component or it's that metric or something, that's not good enough anymore. And this is where, obviously everyone's heard me ranting about observability for a long time now, but I think that the core components of observability you can really boil down to, you need to support high cardinality, high dimensionality, and explorability. And the shift for engineers of going from a world where you had fixed dashboards and you just eyeballed them and kind of pattern matched, that spike matches that spike, so it's probably that. You can't, that's not enough anymore. You can't do that. And the shift to moving to a more explorable, queryable world where you're okay, I'm going to start at the edge, break down by endpoint, break down by, request code, break down by, or whatever. Or if you're using Bubble Up, you're just kind of okay, here's the thing I care about. How is it different from everything else? But it's not getting over that hump of learning to be more fluid and using your tools in a more explorable way. It's different. And it's a really important mental shift that I think all engineers are having to make right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you mentioned earlier, you didn't really have a philosophy. You haven't responded to an incident in a while, but it's that's a philosophy on its own.
True.
one point in your organization, you responded to your last incident like in the depths of the weeds. And I wonder,
Yeah.
what that point was for your business, right? Obviously the business shifted in its own way from a
Yeah.
market perspective and things like that. And it wasn't, maybe the most valuable use of time. And you're
Yeah.
also, by doing that, you're also giving everyone else a chance to do what they do best at, which is what you mentioned, right? Which is an
Yeah.
amazing philosophy on its own, is like giving people the time and space to become experts and to build their expertise.
Yeah. Well, that was pretty early on for us, and it wasn't an intentional thing so much as it was I was CEO for the first 3.5 years. I was constantly flying. I just couldn't, I couldn't do it. And
Yeah.
the other engineers had to pick it up. And before long, there was so much drift that I wasn't the most useful person, right? These are complex breathing systems that are constantly changing, and it doesn't take very long for you to like not be up on them anymore.
But you'd be surprised like how many leaders don't
Yeah,
necessarily.
that's a mistake. That's a big
It is
mistake.
absolutely
I
a mistake.
I
Yeah.
love responding to incidents. Like I fucking I love them. That's my happy place. It's like I have
Yeah.
ADHD, which I just found out about like 2 years ago. But so I never understood why everyone else is freaking out about incidents, and that's when I get dead calm and I can focus the best. The scarier it is, the better I can focus. And I'm just like, wee. So this was really
Me
hard for
too.
me to want to give up because I suddenly don't have any times where I really feel like I'm useful anymore. But you have to,
Yeah.
because just like you said, you have to let your team become the experts. If you cling to that, you cling to it too hard, you're just preventing them from being the best team that they could be.
I will
Exactly.
give you an
And they
example.
won't feel like you trust them. That's the
Yeah,
thing. Like if I show up every
Yeah.
time, they're just going to be like, she doesn't trust us. So
yeah.
It's trust.
I was
It's
gonna
like you're also
say,
not the best person for the job anymore. It's
yeah,
like there are a number of
all of
different
it.
things.
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you guys. I was just gonna say that like I have a old leader that back in the day, he incredible and very technical and very smart, and I would have to have side conversations with him and be like, you like people love having you in there, but like you
Yeah,
also are preventing them from like learning
yeah,
this. Like let's wait, like give him a. I know we want to get this taken care of, but
yeah,
like give him that little bit of because like it does have a different reaction than people all of a sudden are
yeah,
like, oh boy, like they're here,
yeah.
they're going to tell us what to do. Like, we'll just wait to be told instead of saying, actually, I
That's the
know that this
thing.
connects to this and this is how I should, like, we fixed this before. Like, they may, you could have a more junior engineer in there that's never
They'll get
interacted
there.
with this
They'll get
SVP
there.
before. And they're like, whoa, like, I'm not speaking up right
Yeah,
now. Like,
yeah. It
That's
totally it removes a sense of safety. It adds an edge of fear. It makes, and the thing is that like when you're dealing with leaders like this, and I've been one before, you just have to like look them in the eye and shake their shoulders and say, it's not about you. It's not
yeah.
about you anymore. You are
They
not
got
as clutch as you think you are, and it's not
yeah.
your job to be as clutch as you want to be. You need to step aside and let the next generation. They'll fumble it a little bit. It might take them a little longer the first time, but they'll get there, and they
yeah.
have to.
I was in an organization that was like, it was a public facing company. It was used by so many different folks in the world. And still, even after all that, the CTO would jump
Yep.
into incidents
It's
and
not
you would see
okay.
as soon as they joined the channel,
Everybody
you know,
stops talking.
it would, well, no, it would go from one person is talking to several people are talking, and the time between people hitting enter increased. And
Ah,
and this person didn't realize it, but it was like
yeah,
almost like you had to take them through it. Like, it's just showing them how the tenor of the incident changes. And it's not
yeah,
even just people that high up, it's certain senior engineers too. And like, so I think also as leaders, we have to be really intentional about what we're rewarding and
totally.
how things are happening, because I also saw at that organization as well, like very senior engineers, even when they entered the channel, they would come in and just save the day. There was one engineer that when they joined, everyone reacted with the Batman emoji, and they were like the most principal engineer, and I saw more junior engineers acting like this person. And they're
Mm,
holding on to information. They had their own private dashboards. Because it was like
yeah,
kind of what we were incentivizing was this culture where you came in and saved the day as well, and it
yeah,
was kind of fascinating.
yeah.
Um,
I think Nora,
Super real.
one of the things like along that line is that like obviously we have jelly that we've been using, and one of the things that like is really shining through there is where we've got those folks that the incident's called, they're hopping in there, they're not on call, and they're doing work, and it's there's an interesting a lot of opportunity to learn about that, because there are situations where maybe we don't have the right page set up for that particular type of event, or like there's many different elements that can contribute to that happening. But one of them is, it is, but like when shit really hits the fan, I bet you all have your your top 4 or 5 engineers that like you're pinging on the side being like, hey, are you watching this? And like, holding, because that they're going to be able to come in and really like help, but at the same time there's just so much to learn about how to manage the people element of, because again, if you keep having them come in and do that, like that's not going to help the organization overall. Like
I think ultimately, like in that case, you have to get to a point where you say, thank you so much for being here. We do rely on you sometimes, but wait for us to ask you. Wait for someone to escalate to you before you jump in, because that gives the incident commander, and that gives the front line, that gives them a genuine chance to try and solve it themselves without just kind of constantly looking over their shoulder, going, when is so and so going to jump in and fix it for us, right? And they know that they need to give it a shot. And and that person is still available, but like the training wheels, you need to like try and wobble around with the training wheels off a little bit before you reach for them.
Yeah,
and it's incentivizing, giving them the opportunity to teach others their skills, and like this is how you become even more senior, is by doing stuff like this.
Also, when you do escalate to someone, ask them to come in and try not to do hands-on themselves, but just to answer questions about where to look.
Yeah. One of the things that we did recently, look, I guess it's not, man, my brain it's been a while that we've had this, but we got away from having an engineer lead like constantly in our high severity incidents. And it worked pretty well for a while. And we were seeing that things were like, but one of the things that we were noticing is that there wasn't always someone there to kind of take the brunt of a business decision being made. And what I mean by that is when trade-off conversations are happening, having the right person to ask a couple of those pointed questions that has a broader breadth to help really be able, and to raise their hand and say, yes, go ahead and do that. Like, I'm here, I've got you. Yes, go. And really doing exactly what you're saying, which is most of the time really listening and making sure that the team has what they need, but then finding the opportune moments to make sure that we are like, things are moving along, the questions are getting asked, and again, like really taking on like the responsibility, again, that pressure off those engineers where they may not be as comfortable to say, yes, like we need to do this. We, one of the things at Zendesk right now that like we're very, very, very like laser focused on is reducing all of our mean times too. So, we've got a bunch of different mean times too. And I'm saying that in the sense that we've got a bunch of them that are mean time to resolve, mean time to activate, all of those. And I think that like there's these very interesting pockets of responding to the incident where like little by little reducing that time to like, especially around that type of a thing where, again, there's a debate going back and forth of whether or not to do something. And it's, again, just...
especially when it comes down to like not the engineering decisions, but like the business decisions, right? A lot of engineers will feel like, okay, but now I'm at this risky precipice, and like I'm not sure how to make this decision about this risk to the business, and like how to analyze that. Like that's really important. Do you solve this with roles?
Yeah, so I think that's so we now have our engineering lead on call rotation, which is pretty much, this is a little inside baseball, but like director plus, we follow the sun first and secondary, and we have a handful of senior managers that are in that, but those are senior managers that this is a growth opportunity for them to be able to get to that. It's a it's a great opportunity to get some visibility and to show leadership skills outside of what their area is. And I think that what's interesting, again, like observing different incidents where we have different leaders, they take different approaches, right? Like you have some of the ones that are like they're there, they have their presence, they're listening, and then like they're ready to go with their like three very specific questions as soon as there's a break and the conversation. Where there's other leaders that that get a little bit more involved. And so I think the most important piece of that role is the relationship with the incident manager. So like IIMs should be they are in charge ultimately, right? Like they are the ones that are making sure that, they're doing all the things. But I think that like that partnership between the Eng lead and the IM, and, even having a little back channel conversation between those two on Slack to just say like, hey, like I'm hearing where I'd rather make sure that they're pushing things along instead of having me jump in, because if I jump in, then it can shift like, oh, whoa, why is all of a sudden the engineer asking this question, So I think that there's a lot of opportunity to like, and that works well in a situation where you don't have a lot of people that are trying to exert a lot of, it's not those like, power grab situations. We don't really have that at Zendesk. Like people are like I was mentioning earlier, like it's a really collaborative and all for one type of like the way that we operate. But I think that there's unique elements like that like I wouldn't necessarily recommend having that role for all like all programs, right? Like that might not be the right fit. Like you may not like, that might actually not be the way to become more effective. But for us, that's helpful in the sense of let's make sure that there's someone there to really own those critical decisions.
Yeah, makes sense.
Erin, you touch on this a little bit, but I mean, a lot of the folks that are going to be listening to this have, no idea the amazing learning from incidents culture that you are building at Zendesk, and how hard and intentional that, is with a really large organization with a very pervasive tool in the industry. And I'm curious, you obviously can't distill it in like a 5-minute thing, but I'm curious what advice you might have for other folks looking to create an intentional learning culture there. And I think one of the things you suggested was that you put it on the career ladder a little bit, right? And so folks are being rewarded for it in a way. And I think, more of the tech industry needs to do that and be that intentional about it. But is there any other advice you might give to folks?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a really good question. And it's funny, like, trying to squeeze it into a 5-minute, keeping it short. I think that like it really starts at, from the, like the incident, like the folks that are responsible for incident management, right? Like wanting to make sure that like they are understanding and like operating their processes as efficiently as possible, right? So like when we do that and we learn from, like, we take the opportunity to really have a blameless culture and that is something that we really do stand by at Zendesk. We always have. Like, I feel like I keep kind of mentioning these rah things about Zendesk, but it is true. Like
you should be proud.
We do practice these things. And I do think though that started from a very, very early foundation. I think that like we have maintained that culture, which helps quite a bit from like the learning, right? Like the opportunity to learn. I will say that like what we ended up doing is we collect I mentioned this earlier, like we collect a lot of data. Our incident retrospectives, like very intricate. Like we have, at the end of every incident, there's a report owner that's assigned. There may be one, if it's a large incident, there may be more than one. And they work together. They work on, doing their full RCA. And there's so much information.
What's an
RCA? Root cause analysis. Yeah. And as part of that process, it's really the work that they do to really understand what had happened, providing the story, the narrative, the timeline, the impact, remediations, and like being able to then, we have our meeting where we go through, we talk about the incident, and then from there, like we push out our public postmortem that is shared out to customers. We also have an event analysis that we do prepare within 72 hours that gets shared with some of our customers upon request, just because this is what we know at this point. That also helps a lot with our customer piece. That's not about learning though. So I think that like what we've done is we have established a pretty strong like process that like has worked for Zendesk to like pretty well, in the sense that like we've been able to learn quite a bit from what our incidents, and like those our remediation item process. We have SLAs against our remediations, and with those remediations, I think that I was mentioning like the chaos engineering, like that's a more recent, and I'm saying these timelines, which me saying recent could actually mean a little bit longer, but taking those and saying, hey, we had this incident, let's do this exercise and validate that like all of these remediations that you said are completed, like we are good, we've mitigated this risk. And there's this whole piece of, I mentioned about the data that we collect, right? And being able to put together a narrative and a story that like is really able to help the business understand what it is that we're dealing with, and how are we actually taking that data and making changes. Like how do we drive the business to actually recognize where we need to be making improvements. And again, like we've been collecting this data for years now, so we've got a lot of historical context, and it's very helpful. And I think what we've done now with adding Jelly to the mix with this is that it's a whole other layer for us, that like we haven't been able to get that level of insight, and we were ready for it. Like we, in terms of being able to do things like pulling, our timeline together from various Slack channels, like, and being able to see like the human element and involvement and participation. I think, there's like, those are two really big spaces that like we had some blind spots to, because again, when I talk about like us trying to reduce like our times, like, our mean times too, like there are things that are happening in other Slack channels that where there's time spent on triage that is like, like there's these pieces that like, sure, you can put into a big write-up of a report that like, oh, we triaged this in the such and such Slack channel with a link to the Slack channel, but that's not doing you any good to actually like,
when you talk about blameless culture and all this stuff, is that just within engineering, or is that company wide?
Good question.
I mean, I think it's company wide. I mean, I think every organization kind of has their own little.
Because this is something that I have definitely struggled with a little bit, and I don't mean to like throw other org under the bus or anything, but like, in engineering, I feel like we have for a couple of decades now been working on training. Like none of us like just shows up like out of college or whatever, just like, yay, I know how to admit my mistakes and not feel safe and everything. Like this has been like a very conscious, very intentional, like multi-year, multi-decade effort on behalf of the entire engineering culture to try and, and like depersonalize everything in code reviews, to like create, blameless retros, to like, and we still struggle with it. And it's something where I feel like, other parts of the business, like sales and marketing, they're still fucking petrified. They're just like so afraid to talk about mistakes in public. And this is, so I keep like trying to find out if there are companies out there who are trying to expand this beyond engineering, because it feels so needed to me and I'm not sure how to do it.
So Charity, would love to, so I can talk to that in a little bit of a different way than like how I would say like blameless. So we do a lot of work with our go-to-market folks in terms of enabling them to be informed during an incident, like immediately after an incident. They have process around where they can understand what's happening. Like we obviously maintain our space where we're actually active responding to the incident, but there's other ways for them to gain information so that they can communicate with their customers. I think that like Zendesk is also a pretty transparent company when it comes to taking responsibility for where we've had missteps. And I think that but I will say, when we have, I will call them noisy times, it's where we are not aware that we may not have that many high severity incidents, right? But like we could have an enterprise customer that has a bug that hasn't been, that's taking longer to get fixed than they expect. They could be having an integration issue that has nothing to do with Zendesk's side, but it's on the other side of it. They could just there could be multitudes of different things that have nothing to do with our incidents, right? And so that's where we run into like the frustration from, I think, our folks that are trying to just support our customers, because I think that that's a big piece of being able to enable them to be able to have the right pieces come together to be able to like work and interact with their customers on those things.
Totally.
And I think that that's
one what you're describing too is like creating this big same team vibe. I've definitely seen engineering cultures where they're like, no, if you refer to this doc that we've pinned in our channel, it's actually not an incident. So you can't talk to us right now, like you're a ticket. And it like becomes incredibly frustrating for everybody. And you're not actually like, the engineers, even though they may be creating this internal blameless culture, they're not really having that vibe with their other colleagues too. So I really like what you're saying.
Yeah. One of the other things that we implemented a while back was we have an engineering leadership escalation process. So if there's a customer that is frustrated and they have whatever's going on, and they're of us, our customer success folk or person can go in and put in a request, and basically, depending on either executive sponsorship and or expertise in that particular area, we then can line them up to be able to have a direct conversation with one of our leaders within engineering. This is something that originated from, I used to have to manage like crazy intake and like spreadsheets of, frustration from certain like customers, right? And like, and there were a couple of us that would take those calls and just like, you would get on a call and you would listen, and you like, most of the time it was, they just wanted to be heard, and they just wanted to hear directly from somebody that was closer to it. And I think that like, again, I mentioned that event analysis document that we put together. I think that also went a long way with bridging that gap a little bit with like, hey, like we don't know everything yet, but this is what we do know. Like this is, and this is what we're doing about it right now. So like, I think that there's ways to kind of bring it in so that, the way in which the rest of the organization is trusting in, the engineering organization as a whole. Like, there's definitely ways to do that. But again, it's what we were saying. I think it goes back quite a bit to the culture element.
I mean, that artifact that you're talking about creating is really a shared vernacular, right? It's like thinking about who's going to read what you're giving to. If you're creating something that is just for engineering and is just about the technical system issues that, they do impact customer success, but they're not written in any sort of language that they can understand, that, doesn't give that same vibe, and it makes them maybe not want to participate afterwards. And I think the tech industry is really cool in that engineering in organizations has a lot of influence. And so if you can enroll other teams and other departments into your processes that are usually quite good, they might be able to learn as well. I was in an incident like several years ago on Super Bowl Sunday where none of the engineers that were on call knew that we were running a Super Bowl commercial. And
oh no.
And we went down during the Super Bowl commercial. And and I came to the incident review the next day, and it was only SREs in the room. No one from marketing was in the room. No one from PR was in the room. And it was just like, it was very much a we should be prepared for every situation vibe.
Yeah.
But like, that's not really maybe we can talk about that a little bit. But I feel like a lot of this is about, how we coordinated here with other departments and exacerbating the issue by not talking to them about it.
Totally.
We only have about 15 minutes here, and I know you both have like really great recent incident stories that I kind of want to hear about. So I want to shift gears a little bit. Charity, I would love to hear about, a recent outage that you all had in as much detail as you're willing to go into, and what you've learned from it, and what you're
First of
still
all,
hoping.
I will say that as much detail as I'm willing to go into is all of the detail. This is one of the marvelous things,
Well, yeah,
one of the
let's
few
keep
marvelous
going.
things about starting a company. I was always so frustrated with like the editing of like, I would be writing a postmortem for here's what happened, and they'd be like scratching like, no, you can't say MongoDB, say our data store, or no, you can't say AWS, say our hosting provider. I'm just like, what the fuck, like this is not helpful. Or they'd be like, no, this reveals too much about the
Well,
algorithms, and blah blah blah. And I'm just like,
that also like
these things,
exacerbates that build versus buy culture that we're still supposed to talk about later.
yes,
But if you're not allowed to name that, you're being like, no one needs to know that we paid for this thing. It's like, yeah, they should know that, because that has nothing to do with your business. And it's like,
yeah. I feel like everybody's always so worried about losing trust with their users. And I just feel like the more transparent you are, the more trust you'll build, because these problems are not easy, and when you go down a couple of times, users might be frustrated. Then you explain what happened and they're going to go, oh, respect. Okay, we'll let you get to it. We'll talk later when things are up. In my experience, more detail is always better. Anyway,
yeah.
And so that was one of the first things that I did as well, CEO at the time. I was just like, look, whatever you want to put in the outage report, anything that's relevant, just write it all. Let people see it. Anyway, so yeah, we had this really interesting outage a week or two ago. Maybe it was just last week, and it's the first time in last time we really had an outage. Might have been something this spring, but before that, it was like a Kafka thing, like a year ago. So this was significant for us, and I got a couple of alerts that Honeycomb was down, and I was like, wow, this is very unusual. And it took us a couple of days to figure out what was going on, and basically what was happening was we were using up all the Lambda capacity, period, repeatedly. And the way our system work is, we have like hot data, which is stored on the SSDs, local SSDs, and then cold data, which is stored in S3, and stuff ages out to S3, pretty quickly. And this outage had to do with SLOs, because every time that someone sets an SLO, they set an SLI, right, which rolls up into an SLO, and the SLI will be like, tell me if we're getting X number of 504s over this time or whatever. So we had this offline job, right, which periodically kicks off and just polls to see if things are meeting the SLI or not. And we realized after a while that we were seeing timestamps way into the future. And what happened was anytime a customer requests an SLO that doesn't exist yet, we backfill everything, because they might be turning on a new SLI, right? They're finding something new. So as soon as somebody requests it, we backfill. And this was happening just over and over and over and over. Didn't have any valid results, so it wouldn't make a cache line. So every single minute it would launch a backfill, and all the Lambda jobs were just spun up, just trying to backfill these SLOs. And what was interesting about this was that, we often think about how users are going to abuse our systems, and we try to make these, these guardrails and these limits and everything. And in fact, most of our interesting outages or edge cases or whatever come from people who are using the system as intended, but in a really creative, weird way, right? This is not something that we ever would have checked for, because it's completely valid. People will spin up SLIs and need to backfill them. People will set dates in the future. All of these are super valid. I feel like when I was working on Parse, I learned the very hard lesson repeatedly about creating these bounds checks to protect the platform from any given individual, right? But it becomes so much more interesting and difficult of a problem if what they're doing is valid, but in some way, because of the size of the customer or because of, or whatever, it just is incredibly expensive.
Yeah.
So we have a really big write-up. Go ahead.
I was going to say it's always very interesting to see how creative people can get with using your systems. Like some things that you
And
were just
often
like, wow, like I would never like, wow, they
often
they
it's a
really are.
mistake.
Yeah.
Often it's a mistake or something where, it might be intentional and completely legit, but they're doing a very extreme version of it, right? Like one of the very first things that we ran into with Honeycomb, we do high cardinality, high dimensionality, all this stuff. And, we started seeing customers run out of cardinality, not in the values, but in the keys, because they accidentally swapped the key value pairs. And so they were just like, so the key would have like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, instead of like it being in the value. And that's where we realized that, our cap on number of unique key values is somewhere around the number of Unix file system handles that we can hold open. So now we limit it to like 1,500 or something like that, right? But this is why I'm so, you can see my shirt, it's test and prod or live a lie. This shit is never going to come up in test environments. It's never. You're only ever going to see it at the conjunction of your code, your infrastructure, a point in time with users using it, right? And this is why it's so important to instrument your code, keep a close eye on it while it's new. Like deploying is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of baking your code. It's the beginning of testing it out and seeing if it's resilient and responsible or not. And you just have to put it out there, keep an eye on it, and watch it for a little bit. Like that's the and fortunately we had the kind of instrumentation and the kind of detail where we were able to pretty quickly like figure it out once we went to look. But you can't predict this stuff. You shouldn't even try. It's just impossible. You got to test and prod.
It's a waste of time to try to predict it
it's
too.
a complete waste of time.
Right? Like you'll find out, like it will come up quickly. Every limit and every system is there for a reason. There is a story behind every single one.
Exactly. And people who spend all this time writing elaborate tests, just trying to test it's a waste of time because they spend a lot of time. Now the time it takes them to run their tests is forever. It takes them a long time to deploy. Take that time and energy that you're investing into making all these wacky tests and invest in instrumentation. That effort will pay off.
Yeah, totally. That is an awesome one. Erin, I'm going to turn it over to you. Can you tell us about a recent outage that you all had?
Yes, and unlike Charity, I am not the CEO, so I have to be a little bit more careful with with some of the details that I possibly share. But I think that before we got on this call, I was going back and kind of looking through recent incidents that we've had, and I think that one of the things that I just want to like call out is that it's interesting to see how over time your type of incidents and like the nature of them can change. I don't have like one of my obvious ones that normally I'd be like, yes, I'm sure we have one of these recently. And no, it's been pretty quiet in that space for a while, right? So I think that, I want to just talk a little bit, this is a little bit different because I think that this is an interesting one in the sense that it's more about the process of how I'm going to talk about it than it is about the actual incident itself. We, of course I am, because that's, where I always come from. But, we had an incident that was called recently. And the nature of it was, the question came up of, is this a security incident or is this a service incident? And the team realized like, we can handle this within, like we already tried escalating up through security. They said that this was on the customer side. So, we're going to just like, it's not technically, it's not a security incident. And so we managed it because we could take those actions through the service side. Like, we had the right engineers and all of that. But I think that like one of the things that came back out of that was more of this understanding and discussion around like, there was more of a risk from the standpoint of not, was that actually the right direction for us to go in terms of handling that from a process perspective, or would it have been better served managed differently because of the fact that the engineering work that was required was not necessarily a high severity. Like we downgraded the incident to a lower severity level because it was something that for them wasn't that, but reflecting back and looking at it, it was like, there's a couple of gotchas like in here that we need to be more aware of, that like, are we actually following that process from like the process from the right standpoint, even though it doesn't fit in that perfect box of, of what it is. So, I also have, security incidents also roll up through, like we are responsible for service incident or security incidents as well. But we have our, our triage and threat and triage team is through our cybersecurity organization. So we partner very, very closely with them. And so obviously that's something that like there's some really strong learnings from that to kind of follow the tail of, because that's also one where it was very specific for a particular customer, right? It wasn't a widespread thing. It was one particular customer that was having this issue. So, following that trail and determining when it's a situation of like, rightfully so, the individual was like, we need to take care of this. And so they raised an incident and it's like, wow, is it truly, is it not? But it needed to get taken care of. So,
Right.
But I think, those are the types of things that are always very interesting in terms of like, it's totally off. It's not a common thing that would happen. And so, you got to go back and just kind of review and figure out how to.
Those incidents where it's not affecting everyone, those can be the trickiest ones to figure out. Especially when, your SLO or your SLI is like, yeah, we're at 99.9% reliability, but it's because everybody whose first name starts with like SLID thinks you're 100% down, or some of those really weird little edge cases. This is where a lot of my anger at dashboards comes from, because dashboards just cover over all those sins. And you're just like, everything's fine, while people are just like, no, it's not.
Yeah.
Erin, you were talking about a lot of the metrics you're measuring earlier. And recently I've been coming up, I think metrics have value in their own, and I have a lot of gripes with some of them too. I think, sometimes we over index on them, but I've been trying to come up with more creative metrics lately. And one of them is how long someone spends waffling trying to decide if something's an incident. Like, like
I love it.
Sitting there trying to figure it out, or trying to figure out the severity and like the time it takes, how many people they rope into a conversation. I was at one org that used to get paged all the time, and people just stopped wanting to bother each other because everyone was getting woken up so much that one day people would open up incident channels on their own and then sit there by themselves typing everything they were doing for like 2 hours before they brought anyone else in, which was fascinating. And so we started recording that like time before paging another person in and thinking it was a serious thing. So it just reminded me of that.
Oh, wow.
Cool. Well, we are wrapping up time now. We probably have time for one more question. And I'm trying to, there's like 3 really great ones. So I'm trying to figure out which one I want y'all to answer.
We're just going to have to do a second round at some point.
Yeah. Like a follow-up, a part 2. We'll just end it on a cliffhanger. I guess I will ask, I know, Charity, you have thoughts on this. Like, I want to hear you talk about like build versus buy with regard to tooling for any phase of the incident lifecycle. You touched on it a little bit earlier, so I feel like it's good for us to call back to that.
Yeah. So I preach with the religious zeal of the converted. For the longest time, I was one of the neckbeards who just like, no, I will not outsource my core functions. I am going to run my own mail. Because I want to be able to grep through the mail spools, and it's so scary when I can't figure out exactly where the mail went. Like, it goes up to Google and like, what the fuck? All right, that was a long time ago, but it's still, it was a big deal for me to like kind of overcome that and go, okay, I can outsource this to Google. Okay, I can do this, whatever. But even up to like, and including parse, I was like, no, metrics are a thing that I refuse to give to someone else. They're too critical. They're too core. I need to be able to get my hands in there and figure it out. And I have come around full circle on that, and did so before starting Honeycomb, just because the thing that I mentioned earlier about you never want your telemetry to be on the same anything as your production systems, huge thing. But also, like, this really, it's a big and really important part of the entire, call it DevOps transformation or whatever, which is just that, we as engineers, the problem space is exploding. Like, the number of, it used to be you had the database to run. Now you've got fucking, how many data stores do you have? Like, And you can't be expert in all of them. You probably can't be expert in any of them and also do a bunch of other stuff. And like telemetry, for a long time, it was just the case that you're going to get kind of shitty metrics and dashboards, whether you ran them yourself or you paid someone else to do it. That's not the case anymore. Like, it's come a long way. You could give somebody else money to do it way better than you could. And that frees up engineering cycles for you to do what you do best, right? What you do best is the reason that your company exists, right? They're your crown jewels. It's what you spend your life, caring about. And you want to make that, as an engineering leader, you should make that list of things that you have to care about as small as possible so you can do them as well as you can, right? And everything that's not in that absolutely critical list, like, get someone else to do it better than you can. Like, it's so much cheaper to pay someone else to run services than to like have this enormous sprawling engineering team that's focused on 50 million different things. That's not how you succeed.
That has nothing to do with like your core business or how you make money.
Exactly. Take your head count and spend them on the things that you do and do them best.
Yep. I love it. Erin, anything to add there before we wrap up here?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that it makes a lot of sense. And I'm also responsible for like our vendor resilience. So like dealing with, understanding what our capabilities are, the vendors, and like what we've agreed to, going back, looking at contracts, understanding.
Now I want to pick your brain about that, Erin.
So there's this whole, there's a whole binder full of goodies that I have for it. But yeah, I think that there's a way to look at it from a perspective of, there's ways in which that, we are getting more sophisticated in how we are creating our systems and our ecosystems in general overall. And like the dependency, there is the web of things that everybody's connecting to and using and leveraging. And I think that what is best, again, I will go back to what I was bringing up earlier, which is starting from a risk perspective of, really actually understanding like, what is your risk tolerance? Like, outsourcing that, looking to use this tool. Okay. What are the risks associated with doing that? And like, is it, are you willing to take those risks, such as the dependency, right? And like, again, like what are the things that you can do to ensure that you are mitigating that risk as much as possible by creating workarounds and, really thinking about your technology continuity element of things and how you're developing around that dependency, right?
When I was at Parse, like we were like, okay, our core function, what we do is we build the infrastructure so mobile developers can build their apps, right? So operations was absolutely core to us. We had to run our own MongoDB systems because it was the core, it was what we did, right?
Yeah.
But for most people, it's not what you do. Go use RDS.
It's fine. You're still a good engineer if you
You're still a good engineer, I promise.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's interesting too, because I think that there's, we have certain things that like internally at Zendesk that have been built and there's been a lot of work that's gone into them, and they have a lot of people know what it is.
Subclass fallacies.
But also at the same time, like there's this tipping point where that becomes like, okay, we have this dependence, like we created this, we have to maintain it, we have to keep it alive. Like, at what point do you get to where that becomes like, okay, this is a much larger task than it would be to outsource it? So, like, I think that there's different phases. And
also future proofing, because the people who built it and run it might not be there forever. And how do you feel?
Especially if that thing is involved in a ton of incidents, they are going to burn out and leave, and no one's going to know how to run
True facts.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we went through a huge exercise a couple years ago where, the whole entire thing around, ownership and self-service and like really making sure that like everything had a clear owner. And I mean, it seems like it's a simple thing to say that, but like when you have multiple different, like it's something that just existed from the beginning, and it's like, well, we don't own that. We just use it. We don't own it. We just use it. Like, it's like, well, somebody's got to own it because this thing keeps breaking. So can we please figure out who's actually going to take on the responsibility of it? And I think that's also, you end up with people that they leave, and then you're like, okay, does anybody know what's going on here?
Right. Yep. And it becomes more critical than ever.
Right.
Well, now I really want to do a part 2 with y'all. In person, wine, whiskey, part 2.
Absolutely.
We can totally do that, and we can record one as well. But thank you both for joining me today. Really, really appreciated the conversation. And yeah, look forward to talking more later.
Thanks, Nora.
Yeah,
Thanks,
this was
Erin.
great. Thanks. Yeah.